Before we start the story, let me know in the comments how you liked it and where you're watching from. If you enjoyed the content, make sure to subscribe and share a real incident from your own life that relates to this story. The comment with the most likes will be turned into the next story. It was supposed to be a business deal. Nothing more, nothing less. Thomas Blake, a single dad scraping by on a mechanic's salary, was no stranger to tough decisions. He'd been making them every day since his wife had left, leaving him alone with his 5-year-old daughter, Lily. His world was small. The cracked pavement outside his shabby little house, the greasy tools in his garage, and the worn-out toys that kept Lily entertained while he worked. But everything changed the day he got that call. A lawyer's voice on the other end, smooth and cold, told him that his life was about to take a sharp turn. He'd been offered a deal he couldn't refuse. Marry a woman, a billionaire woman. And in return, his financial problems would vanish. No more debt, no more late bills, no more wondering if he'd have to sell his house to make ends meet. The catch? She was disabled. Emma Kensington, a woman in her mid-30s, had been in a wheelchair for years after a car accident left her paralyzed. To some, it might sound like a sad story. To Thomas, it sounded like a paycheck. Think of it as a contract, the lawyer had said. A marriage of convenience. You'll get everything you need: money, security, stability for your daughter. And in return, Mrs. Kensington needs a companion. Someone to stand by her side for business reasons, mostly. Thomas hesitated. The weight of his responsibility as a father bearing down on him. He looked at Lily, curled up on the couch, her face bathed in the warm glow of the TV. What else could he do? They weren't living, they were surviving. He needed to make a decision, fast. He'd never been the type to put his personal feelings ahead of his family's needs. Hell, he hadn't dated since his wife left, and the idea of marrying a woman he didn't love seemed like a punch to the gut. But then again, he wasn't in the business of making idealistic choices. He was in the business of doing whatever it took to keep Lily safe and happy. The contract was signed, the lawyers dealt with the finer details, and before he knew it, Thomas was standing in front of Emma Kensington, staring at the woman he was about to marry. She was more beautiful than he expected, her auburn hair falling in waves over her shoulders, her green eyes sharp but distant. And there she was, sitting in her custom-made wheelchair, like some kind of untouchable queen, while Thomas felt like the hired help. "Are you sure about this?" Emma asked, her voice steady but guarded. He nodded. "It's a deal, that's all it needs to be." Her lips curled into a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "All right then. Just remember, this is for both of our good." As Thomas sat in the lavish mansion, the air thick with awkward tension, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He'd signed up for wealth and security, sure, but there was a part of him, something deep down, that wondered if he'd made the wrong choice. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, like he was just another thing on a list to be dealt with. Or maybe it was the way she had this certain sadness to her, as though all the money in the world couldn't fix whatever was broken inside of her. The day of the wedding arrived faster than Thomas could process, like a freight train barreling down the tracks with no way to stop it. It wasn't a fairy tale. There were no princesses or grand declarations of love. Instead, it was a carefully orchestrated event in a massive ballroom, with guests dressed in gowns and tuxedos that cost more than his entire house. The chandelier above sparkled like something out of a movie, casting a soft glow over the polished marble floors. The whole place smelled of fresh roses and expensive perfume, a stark contrast to the smell of motor oil and sweat that Thomas was used to. He stood there in his tuxedo, feeling like an imposter in a world that wasn't his. Every guest in that room had more money than he'd ever dreamed of, and here he was, just a guy from a small town, a mechanic who fixed things and kept to himself. But today he was about to marry a woman with $1 billion fortune. No pressure, right? Emma hadn't spoken much since they'd signed the contract. She'd been distant, almost cold, like she was doing this because she had to, not because she wanted to. It bothered him more than he cared to admit, but what could he do? He was here for Lily, for her future. This was the only way forward. The guests were all seated. The music began to play, and Thomas found himself walking down the aisle, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. He glanced over at the crowd. They weren't looking at him, not really. They were all watching Emma, waiting for her to make her entrance. When she did, Thomas could hardly breathe. She was stunning in an elegant, understated way. Her long, flowing dress clung to her like it was made for her, her face flawless and composed. But it was the way she moved, or rather, how she didn't, that caught his attention. She was pushed down the aisle in her chair, her eyes forward, her expression unreadable. "Do you, Thomas Blake, take Emma Kensington to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the officiant asked. It was all just a formality. He barely heard the words, just nodded and mumbled, "I do." His voice felt foreign in his mouth, like he wasn't even part of this life. "And do you, Emma Kensington, take Thomas Blake to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Emma's lips parted. But instead of saying the customary "I do," she paused, her gaze locking onto Thomas. For a moment he felt like he was drowning in the depth of her eyes. Then, just as the tension became unbearable, she said, "I do." But it wasn't the words that caught him off guard. It was what happened next. The music stopped. Without warning, Emma began to move. Slowly, painfully, she reached for the arms of her chair, her fingers gripping the sides with determination. Thomas watched, his eyes wide, as she slowly, cautiously pushed herself up from the chair. It was like a dream, or a nightmare. He couldn't tell. For a split second, everyone in the room held their breath. The silence was deafening. And then Emma stood. She wasn't supposed to be able to stand. Her legs were paralyzed. But there she was, defying everything Thomas thought he knew. The crowd gasped. Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. Emma looked at him, her eyes burning with intensity. She straightened her back, standing tall despite the pain in her face. And then, with a quiet but powerful voice, she said the words that would change everything. "You don't know who I really am." The silence in the room was suffocating. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Thomas was still standing there, half expecting someone to yell "cut," like this was some bizarre rehearsal for a movie. But no, this was real. Emma Kensington, his new wife, was standing in front of him, her eyes fiery with something he couldn't quite place. The gasp from the crowd reverberated through the grand ballroom, like the air itself was sucked out of the space. Thomas, completely caught off guard, took a step back. His legs felt weak beneath him, like the floor was buckling under his feet. "What the hell?" he mumbled under his breath, his voice hoarse. Emma didn't seem to care about the reactions around her. She steadied herself, her breathing shallow but composed. Her fingers, once clutching the arms of the wheelchair, now rested at her sides. She wasn't looking at the guests anymore, not at the billionaire friends and business partners who had gathered to witness this spectacle. No, her gaze was firmly locked onto Thomas, as if she were trying to send some unspoken message through sheer willpower. "You think this is just about money, don't you?" she asked, her voice still calm but laced with an edge of bitterness. Thomas opened his mouth to speak but found no words. He looked around, but no one seemed willing to intervene. He felt a mix of confusion, fear, and anger bubbling up inside him. What was this? What the hell was going on? The officiant, still trying to salvage some semblance of normalcy, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Kensington, perhaps we should—" "No," Emma cut him off, holding up a hand. Her focus never wavered from Thomas. "I need to explain. Now." Her voice was firm, but there was a trace of vulnerability that made Thomas feel like a fool. He had assumed this whole thing was a cold, transactional arrangement. That's all it was supposed to be. But standing there, watching her, he realized how little he truly knew about her. Thomas swallowed, unsure of how to respond. But before he could say anything, Emma took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking again. I didn't want to get married, not like this, not to you, but the terms, well, they weren't exactly what you think. This wasn't about a simple business deal, it was never meant to be. She paused, and for the first time, Thomas saw a flicker of emotion in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or regret. I was never supposed to need you. But I do now. Thomas's heart raced, his mind struggling to catch up with the words he was hearing. What the hell do you mean by that? Emma took another step. Forward, the action slow and deliberate, as if every movement took all the strength she had. Her voice was quieter now, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of a secret that had been locked away for far too long. I'm not just paralyzed, Thomas. I was never really paralyzed. She glanced down at her legs, her lips trembling. The accident? That was real. But the wheelchair, the medical bills, the sympathy, it was all part of the plan. Part of a very, very dangerous game. The crowd was hushed, and Thomas felt like he'd been punched in the gut. His mind couldn't process what she was saying. What do you mean? You've been lying all this time? Emma nodded, but there was no smugness in her expression. No pride, just exhaustion. I didn't choose this life, she said, her voice breaking slightly. I didn't choose to be the puppet of a corporation that wanted me to marry a man like you. Someone expendable. Someone they could control. Thomas's head spun. His stomach churned. He had been the pawn in someone else's game. And the worst part, he hadn't even known it. His whole life, his whole reason for being here, had been based on lies. Who are they? Thomas finally managed, his voice thick with confusion and anger. Who's behind all this? Emma's eyes shifted, glancing around the room at the guests, the billionaires, the ones who had watched her stand and make her declaration. She took a deep breath before responding, her words heavy with meaning. I'll tell you everything, but we don't have much time. Emma's words hung in the air like a storm about to break, and Thomas stood frozen, trying to wrap his mind around everything she had just said. The grand ballroom around them felt like it was closing in. The lavish decorations, the opulent furniture, the high-pitched laughter from the guests, it all faded into the background. It was just him and Emma now, like the rest of the world had ceased to exist. She stepped back, finally breaking eye contact with Thomas, and looked down at her chair. It was an odd, surreal moment. She was standing, but it was like she wasn't really there. Not physically, at least. Thomas began, but his voice faltered. He had so many questions, so much anger building up inside him, but nothing came out. He couldn't make sense of any of this. You've been lying to me? She shook her head, slowly, deliberately, as though the act of speaking the truth was physically painful, not lying, hiding the truth, for my own survival. Thomas clenched his fists, his mind reeling. He had been playing a part in something he didn't understand, something dark. You think this was just about us getting married and me living off your money? Emma continued, her voice a little softer now. That's what they wanted you to think. Hell, that's what I wanted to think too at first. I thought I'd be able to escape, but then I realized I was just as trapped as you were, just as stuck. She paused and stared at him, the raw emotion in her eyes now replaced by something colder, something sharper. Do you know what I really do? What this whole family, this empire is really about? Thomas shook his head slowly. He could feel a pit opening in his stomach, a gnawing sense of dread spreading through his veins. He had no idea. He thought it was about a company, a fortune. But now it felt like it was something far more sinister. They're controlling people, Thomas, Emma said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. They've been controlling me for years, and I've been using you as part of that plan. You were always meant to be my distraction, a way to make it all seem normal. A family man, someone who'd sell out for a few bucks and some security. It was supposed to be easy. But you don't fit the mold. You're not like the others. She took a breath, steadying herself. That's why they're going to come for you. And when they do, you won't even see it coming. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. Who are they, Emma? Who's behind all of this? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at him, her gaze unreadable, as if weighing the decision to tell him the truth. The room was dead quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning. They're the ones who control everything, the businesses, the banks, the media, even the government. They pull the strings. I don't know who they really are, but I know they've been watching me for years. They think I'm a pawn. But they've underestimated me. Emma paused, glancing down at her legs for a moment. They've underestimated you, too. Thomas's mind was racing. The world he'd just stepped into, this world of power, wealth, and control, was nothing like what he'd imagined. This was bigger than anything he could have ever conceived. His life, his choices, everything had been manipulated. The whole wedding, the whole arrangement. It wasn't just about money. It was about something darker, something far more dangerous. So, what now? Thomas asked, his voice shaking, his grip on the edge of the altar tightening. What do we do? How do we stop them? Emma's eyes softened for a moment, but there was still an edge to her voice. We don't stop them, at least not yet. But we play the game. The only way to win is to learn the rules, and right now, I'm the only one who knows them. If we're going to survive this, we'll have to be smarter than they are. The room around them still seemed frozen in time. The guests were all watching, murmuring amongst themselves, their faces a mix of confusion and curiosity. They had no idea what was happening. They were part of the show, just like Thomas had been. But now, the real game was beginning. As the last words left Emma's lips, Thomas felt like the world was spinning around him. It wasn't just the shock of her revelation, though that was enough to send his brain into overload. It was the fact that this whole thing, his life for the past few weeks, the wedding, the new wealth, the chance to fix everything, had been built on a lie, a carefully constructed facade, and he had been the fool caught in the middle of it. Emma, seeing the confusion in his eyes, took a step closer to him. Her face, which had once seemed distant and cold, now held a sense of urgency that he couldn't ignore. The air between them was thick with tension, and even the sound of distant chatter from the guests felt like an irritating hum in the background. Thomas, listen, Emma said, her voice low and almost pleading. I'm not trying to manipulate you anymore. I just need you to understand. We don't have much time, and we need to get on the same page if we're going to have any shot at surviving this. He looked at her, unsure of what to say. It felt like the ground beneath his feet was shifting, and his whole life was about to collapse. You're telling me you're not paralyzed, and that you're being controlled by some, I don't even know who, and now we're supposed to just play along. She nodded. Yes, you're not the only one being used in this game. I've been trapped by these people for years, but I have a plan now. We're going to take control of this situation, but first, you need to trust me. Trust her. How could he trust someone who had lied to him, used him as a pawn? But as he looked at her, really looked at her, he saw something else. Fear. Real fear. Emma wasn't some manipulative woman enjoying the power she held over him. She was just as much a prisoner in this as he was. Maybe more so. Okay, so what's the plan? Thomas asked, his voice steadier now, though his heart was still pounding in his chest. He had to know what he was getting into. Emma took a deep breath, clearly steeling herself for what was coming. The deal they made with you? It wasn't just about money. They wanted to see if you would take the bait, if you would play your part. But they're watching everything. Everything. Your life, your daughter's life. None of it is safe unless we act fast. She turned her gaze toward the guests again, her eyes scanning the crowd. They have people everywhere, Thomas. And they won't stop until they've made sure we're both completely under their control. Thomas's stomach churned. He had never been one to get caught up in conspiracy theories or big shadowy organizations pulling the strings. But standing here, with Emma's confession weighing heavily on him, it was hard to deny the gravity of her words. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything in his life, the way things had changed, the strange luxury of the wedding, the way his life had been flipped upside down so suddenly, was all connected. A web he had walked right into, thinking it was just a way out of his financial mess. So what now? Thomas repeated, trying to shake off the gnawing sense of helplessness creeping up on him. How do we stop them? You said we have to play along, play by their rules. What does that even mean? Emma's eyes narrowed, a fire sparking behind them. It means we don't go along with everything. We start making our own moves, getting inside information, and using their own game against them. We need to get them to underestimate us. Thomas shook his head in disbelief. So, what? We become part of their game, but make sure we win? That's your big plan? Exactly. Emma's voice was sharper now, more confident. The more they think we're just puppets in their scheme, the more we can control, but only if we stay one step ahead. It's risky, and it won't be easy, but it's the only shot we have. Thomas thought for a moment. He didn't know how to fight this, how to go up against powerful people who controlled everything. But what he did know was that he couldn't just stand by and let this happen. For Lily, for his future, he had to do something. All right, he said, his voice firm now, despite the fear still gnawing at his insides. I'm in, but we do this my way. No more secrets. If we're doing this, you have to tell me everything. No more playing games. Emma nodded, her expression softening just a little. Fair enough, but just remember, Thomas, once we start, there's no going back. He could feel the weight of her words settle over him. He wasn't sure what he had gotten himself into, but one thing was for sure. His life would never be the same. The days after the wedding were a blur. Thomas barely had time to process what had happened, let alone wrap his head around the fact that he was now married to Emma Kensington, a woman who wasn't who she appeared to be, and who had just dragged him into a world of secrets and power games he never imagined. They'd agreed on a temporary truce. Emma had promised to share more, and in return, Thomas would play his part. He was starting to see that this wasn't just about surviving. It was about navigating a game that was rigged from the start. But the rules were still unclear. The first step in Emma's plan was simple: keep up appearances. At least for now. They had to make sure the people pulling the strings never suspected they were onto them. But it was easier said than done. Their first real conversation about strategy came one evening after dinner, in the opulent, dimly lit study inside Emma's mansion. Thomas felt like a stranger in his own skin. Every room in the house seemed to be a reminder that he didn't belong here. But Emma, she seemed to glide through it all, like she'd always been part of this world. All right, Emma said, sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, her chair rolling slowly as she adjusted the position. We need to get on the inside. I have a few contacts that might be able to help, but we can't trust anyone who's been involved in this deal so far. That means no lawyers, no corporate handlers, and definitely no one from my family. They've been part of the game from the beginning. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Your family? You don't trust them? Emma's face darkened for a moment. The people pulling the strings have been using them just as much as they've been using me. The whole thing was set up to look like a legitimate business transaction. But underneath it all, it's about power, control, and they'll do anything to keep it. Thomas felt his stomach churn. He had no idea what he was stepping into. But if Emma was right, if there really was a powerful group orchestrating all of this, he was in over his head. So, what do we do now? He asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. We play the part, Emma replied, her voice steady. We pretend to be the happy couple. We go to the gala this weekend, meet the right people, and gather intel. The more we can learn about who's really in charge, the better our chances. The word gala made Thomas's skin crawl. He'd never been to anything like that in his life. He was used to grease-stained jeans and the smell of engine oil, not fancy dresses and champagne flutes, but Emma was serious. He could see it in her eyes. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about fighting back. The gala was held in a mansion on the outskirts of the city, one of Emma's properties. When they arrived, Thomas felt like he had stepped into another universe. The marble floors gleamed, the chandeliers sparkled above them like diamonds, and the guests, elegant, rich, and entitled, milled around like they owned the place. Emma, in a stunning silver dress, led him through the crowd with an ease he could never replicate. She moved through the sea of people with practiced grace, her back straight, her smile polite but uninviting. It was clear that she was used to this world. But for Thomas, it was like walking through a minefield, surrounded by people who were looking at him like he didn't belong. "So, what exactly are we doing here?" Thomas asked, his voice low as they navigated their way through the crowd. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every guest seemed to look his way, then turn their heads, whispering behind their champagne glasses. "We're meeting with people who can help us get closer to the core of this thing," Emma said quietly. "I know a few people here who owe me favors. We'll see if they're willing to work with us. But remember, no one can know what we're really after. We're just a couple of rich people enjoying the evening. That's it." The evening dragged on, and Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the entire event was a facade. Everyone was so polished, so perfect, that it felt like they were all playing roles. Everyone, that is, except for Emma. As the night wore on, Emma introduced him to a few key people, none of them particularly memorable, except for one man. A tall, broad-shouldered figure with a dark suit and calculating eyes. His name was James Hawke, and he had a reputation for being ruthless in business dealings. Emma seemed to know him well. "Mr. Hawke," Emma said with a smile that barely touched her eyes, "I'm glad you could make it." Hawke looked Thomas over before his eyes flicked back to Emma. "Of course. Wouldn't miss it for the world. I hear congratulations are in order." "Thank you," Emma said, her smile now full of meaning. "We're starting a new chapter." Thomas caught the tension in the air. The way Hawke was looking at Emma, almost like he was appraising her. It was unsettling, but Thomas knew there was something bigger at play here, something more dangerous. "So, what now?" Thomas asked again, his patience wearing thin. Emma took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his with a flicker of something unreadable. "We wait. For now we observe. We listen. And soon we'll be able to make our move." The weeks after the gala felt like a blur. Every day was a balancing act, with Thomas trying to keep up the charade while Emma slowly started to reveal more about the web they were tangled in. It was like peeling back layers of an onion, each one worse than the last. Thomas didn't know who to trust, where to turn, or even what his own role was anymore. Emma's plan, as it turned out, wasn't just about playing along. It was about finding leverage. They had to gather enough information, enough power to start making demands of their own. The game had to be flipped, but things weren't going as smoothly as they had hoped. One afternoon, as they sat in Emma's study, going through papers and discussing their next move, the phone on her desk rang. She glanced at it, her face going stiff for a moment before she picked it up. "Emma Kensington," she said, her voice as calm as ever, though Thomas could tell there was an undercurrent of tension in it. "Yes, I'll be there soon." She hung up the phone and turned to Thomas, her expression unreadable. "We have a problem." "What's going on?" Thomas asked, his stomach tightening. He had learned to be wary of the calmness in her voice. Whenever she sounded that way, it meant things were about to get real. "They know we're onto them," Emma said, her voice lowering as she leaned in closer. "The people behind this, they've figured out that we're not just playing along anymore. Someone's been watching us." Thomas stood up, his heart pounding. "What? How do they know?" Emma's gaze hardened, her face now a mask of determination. "It doesn't matter how they found out. What matters is that they'll come after us, soon. They'll try to silence us, and if we don't act now, we won't make it out alive. Thomas's mind raced. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that one wrong step could send him plummeting into the unknown. So what do we do? Emma's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time since they'd started this insane journey, she looked truly vulnerable. We have to take the fight to them, Thomas. We can't wait anymore. If we're going to survive, we need to know who's pulling the strings, and we need to know fast. Thomas nodded. He wasn't sure he was ready for whatever came next, but there was no going back. They had pushed themselves this far, and now they had to see it through. Emma reached into the drawer of her desk and pulled out a folder. She slid it across the desk to him. These are the names of the people who've been behind everything, the ones who set this all in motion. They're powerful, they're dangerous, and they've been manipulating everything around us. Thomas picked up the folder, his hands trembling as he opened it. The names on the first page meant nothing to him, but as he scanned the rest of the document, something caught his eye, a name he recognized. James Hawke, he muttered under his breath. His blood ran cold. He's one of them? Emma nodded. Hawke's at the top of the chain. He's the one who's been pulling the strings on the corporate side, but he's just a piece of the puzzle. There's someone even more dangerous behind him. Someone who's been controlling all of us. Who? Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma hesitated, as if the next name she was about to say was the final piece that would shatter everything. My father, Victor Kensington. Thomas felt like the room was spinning. Your father? The same man who built all of this? He gestured around the mansion. You're telling me he's behind all of it? Yes, Emma replied, her voice tight. He's the mastermind. He set everything up, my accident, the company, the marriage, everything. He's been controlling me my whole life, and he's been using you as the perfect pawn in his game. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what Emma was telling him. So, this whole time, we've been playing into his hands? Emma didn't answer right away. She just stared at the papers in front of her, her fingers tapping nervously on the desk. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. I was meant to marry someone else, someone who could give my father more power, but when I met you, I realized that you weren't like the others. You weren't interested in the money, the power. You didn't care about the game. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something darker. I thought I could use you. But now, I'm not so sure. You've gotten too close to the truth, and now they're coming for us. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. So, what's the plan? What do we do now? Emma's gaze sharpened, the old fire returning. We go after my father. We make him think we're still playing his game. But this time, we'll make the rules. The night of the gala felt like a dream, or more accurately, a nightmare Thomas couldn't wake up from. Everything about it, the lavish venue, the expensive gowns, the champagne glasses clinking in the background, felt like it was part of someone else's life, not his. He was just a mechanic, a single dad trying to survive, and yet, here he was, walking through a room full of billionaires and power brokers. Emma, on the other hand, glided through the crowd like she owned it. Every guest seemed to part for her, their gazes lingering on her, some with admiration, others with jealousy. She looked perfect, too perfect. He had to remind himself that this wasn't the real Emma. Not anymore. She wasn't the woman he'd been tricked into marrying. She was something much more dangerous. Remember, no one can know what we're really doing here, Emma said under her breath as they made their way across the ballroom floor. Her voice was low but intense, and Thomas could tell she was on edge, despite her composed demeanor. He nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He wasn't sure how much longer he could pretend to be just another guy in a tuxedo, but for now, that's all they had. Victor Kensington, Emma's father and the man behind everything, stood at the center of the room, surrounded by his usual entourage, business, partners, investors, and people who owed him something. The man exuded power, his presence dominating the entire space. He was everything Thomas wasn't. Confident, untouchable, a puppet master who had carefully crafted this entire game they were stuck in. Emma's grip tightened on Thomas's arm as they approached him. "Play it cool," she whispered, her breath a soft rush of air against his ear. Victor turned as they reached him, his eyes narrowing just slightly as they met Emma's. The tension was palpable, but Emma kept her smile intact, cool and calculating. "Father," she said, her voice smooth and measured. "Good to see you." Victor's eyes flickered to Thomas, but he didn't seem surprised. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "You look content," he remarked dryly, his gaze sharp as he looked between them. "Why wouldn't we be?" Emma replied, her voice steady. "We're finally on the same page." Thomas, standing off to the side, tried to appear relaxed, but the reality of what they were about to do hit him like a ton of bricks. He was playing a part in a game he didn't understand, and it was about to get a lot more dangerous. Victor chuckled darkly, his gaze flicking to Thomas again. "You've done well to keep up the charade," he said, his voice thick with something like amusement. "But you should know you're just a pawn in all of this, Thomas. Just a stepping stone for Emma. You've always been replaceable." Thomas's stomach twisted. There it was, the truth. To Victor, they were nothing more than pieces in his game, and it seemed like he was trying to remind them both of that. But Emma didn't flinch. She held her ground, her expression unwavering. "Actually, Victor," she said, her tone sharp now, "you've underestimated us, and tonight you'll see that your game ends here." Victor's eyes flickered, and for a moment, the air seemed to freeze. His calm facade slipped, just for an instant, before he regained control. But it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted. Emma had said the words that mattered most. As she turned away from him, signaling Thomas to follow, he knew the final move had been made. They weren't just playing the game anymore. They were about to flip the entire board.